Throughout the entire first 19 chapters of the FMA manga, we see a whopping 5 glimpses into the brothers' past. One at the very start with that gruesome yet enthralling opening page, a second after the Tucker storyline, a third during the conversation with Marco, a fourth during the return to Resembool, and a fifth during the Identity Crisis plotline. There are some additional bits of dialogue as well, but visual insights are strictly left to these examples. Until here. Starting at the last page of this chapter, the manga begins a lengthy flashback arc that covers the entirety of the brothers' story before the events of Chapter 1. It not only sheds a light on a moment that has been ruminating since page 1, but also establishes the Elric's connection to their teacher in a way that would otherwise be impossible. This structure, which resulted in so many thematically resonant moments excelling in a way they are otherwise unable, never made it to either anime adaptation. Sound familiar? Just as both adaptations broke up the wish fulfillment arc, so too was the flashback arc split to fit a new structure. And just like last time, one show had more justification than the other when doing this. In 2003, we not only get more emphasis placed on the opening scene of human transmutation, but we also see most of the Elric's backstory immediately following the events of Lior. This assumedly note Al left for Rose is used as a launch pad for a 2003 exclusive version of the flashback arc that repurposes several stories originally set in the present. This use of Alphonse as the narrator for this portion is a truly ingenious move as well, as it allows this expansion on the opening scene to leave out vital information regarding the gate, a plot point 2003 won't expand on for another 26 episodes. We also get some scenes with Trisha here that are entirely original, although I think some folks overstate the amount of these we get due to the manga hosting them in separate locations. This scene of Ed going to Trisha with the pig horse? What are these things? Whatever they are. This scene of Ed showing the fancy version to Trisha is in both, but the manga uses it for a nightmare sequence after the Tucker arc. 2003 adapted this by playing the scene straight, adding Al, and modifying the ending. These stills also make their way into a montage in 2003, while the scene of Ed and Al coming home to find Trisha collapsed also works its way in, albeit with a little more build-up. Even scenes with more liberal changes made to them, like the bird Ed whips up being changed into a doll intended as a gift for Winry, still keep the original intent of the scene completely intact. This is with perhaps the exception of this scene with the rock bells, though I'd argue it's the case even there, and Trisha's passing. This is a pretty major change from the manga, which cuts straight from Trisha's collapse to the funeral. These extra scenes of Trisha on her deathbed are gut-wrenching. You feel the weight of every second as the inevitable demise marches closer. And that's how it should be. This event will set off such a wild domino effect and inform so much of the brothers' decisions going forward. We should feel as attached as they do, if possible. And this scene gets us damn close. The manga doesn't have any of this, and I wish it had all of it. Well, with one exception anyway. The training with Teacher, despite being just as important to Al as it was to Ed, unlike the gate, is reduced to a 30-second montage in episode 3. I understand why this was necessary to some extent. Even if Al likely would have written more about this to Rose, 2003 wouldn't touch on this material again until about the same time it would cover the gate. It wouldn't make sense to give her so much importance here just to drop it for 20-odd episodes. I can also appreciate the art direction on display here with its scratchy, childish style that works well as a breather between serious moments. This leaves my primary issue not so much with truncation, but rather with this particular shot of Azumi. Showing even a silhouette of her gives away the twist that Ed and Al's super powerful and dangerous alchemy teacher is really just some sickly housewife. A twist that I adore, especially in the manga. It's not completely ruined here, but I do think it was a misstep. Brotherhood, on the other hand, is just kind of sporadic and directionless. Though this was due to factors that were somewhat out of the team's control, like the Lior debacle requiring them to reorientate the whole opening act, I still think it misses the mark here in ways that I cannot excuse. That said, I can begrudgingly accept that, with Mr. McDongle now acting as the opening and Lior otherwise being next in the pipe, it makes sense that the team felt compelled to buffer with something. I'd argue that adapting one of the wish fulfillment chapters would have been better suited to that end, but given that the Brotherhood team was also aiming to cover the whole story in just 51 episodes at the time, that may not have been seen as feasible. And moreover, if 2003 was able to get away with splitting the backstory in half, maybe they could too. They could not. In fact, that infraction I talked about earlier with 2003 giving away Azumi's appearance, Broho ends up doing the same thing, but way more egregiously. And it should speak volumes that this is one of Episode 2's lesser infractions. Trisha Elric gets a grand total of 1 scene before dying off screen. 2 minutes is all we get. And this is fine. Yes, it's a little cut down compared to the manga, but not by much. And besides, this part of the story was never really about Trisha anyway. It's about Ed and Al's formative relationship with the Rockbells and Azumi. And to be honest, Brotherhood does decently with the former. We're missing the most important scene with them though, and that is hard to excuse. And as for Azumi, what we get is worse than nothing due to the now destroyed twist. And really, what could have improved this? Giving Trisha more characterization would have been nice, but it wouldn't have saved the episode or the structure of the early series. The same goes for giving us all the training with Azumi now rather than Dublith. It would have been better for this episode, but it wouldn't have saved it, and may have even done more damage to the structure of the early story than the official cut managed. Nothing would have compared to just doing what the manga did and keeping the backstory at the Dublith arc, where it belongs. But of course, they couldn't do that, and the result is beyond compromised from the get-go. All that said, the best way to showcase how poorly this episode fits into the new slot isn't by breaking down these structural problems, it's simply to look at how it opens. The episode starts with Ed and Al discussing their earliest readings on the Philosopher's Stone before awkwardly transitioning into a greater flashback. And by awkwardly, I mean that there is no transition. We go straight from Ed conversing with Al to Ed narrating to the audience with no indication of the shift. I sort of get why they did it though, as I have no idea how an actual conversation between Ed and Al could have gone from talking about the stone to reiterating their entire backstory to each other up to this point. The manga had Azumi to justify this, 2003 had Rose to justify this, and then proceeds to do an unrelated setup that isn't as good but is still better than Brotherhood, which again, has nothing. I wish I could say the direction was good, but the first quarter of the episode is particularly rough even in that department. It's also flat, and fails to use lighting to its advantage. Take the shot of Ed, Al, and Winry for instance. The sequence is almost identical between 2003 and Broho, yet the choice to set one in bright idyllic daylight and the other in a dull overcast does so much legwork for the latter. Perhaps one could argue that the brightness is intended to belie the eventual obsession the brothers, particularly Ed, will get about their goal. But we've already seen the impact losing their mother had on them both in the present and within the context of the flashback. The genie's out of the bottle as far as I'm concerned. There's also just far less interesting storyboarding here. This puts Brotherhood, which was already at a disadvantage with a less than ideal art style for this material, looking far worse in side-by-sides. It's from here that material involving Azumi comes in. Or doesn't, but let's cover things the way the manga did it since it's our target. The manga, as mentioned before, ties its setup for all of this in the Elrics visiting their teacher. This includes a moment of Azumi realizing Ed committed the taboo, and makes her coaxing what happened out of the brothers the framing device for the whole flashback. As for the material within said flashback involving Azumi, the manga elects to keep the day of Ed and Al studying alchemy during math class and the day of the flood separate. However, the paneling and flow still make these events feel very continuous. The flood itself is only shown briefly, with Ed and Al trying to help in an unspecified way before being told by adults to seek higher ground. Just as they attempt to do so, however, Azumi enters the frame. Immediately, the difference between her alchemy and what we've seen so far from the brothers is felt. Even present-day Ed is only shown performing alchemy near this scale once, in the chase with Panina. Following Azumi saving the town, we get a gag about her puking blood before cutting to her at Resenbul's hospital. It's here that Ed and Al are given the opportunity to train under Azumi, albeit with a fair bit of convincing and a very unorthodox first phase. We get a brief conversation between Azumi and Sig on the train ride to Dublith, as well as some brief scenes of Ed and Al acclimating to Dublith before their ride on the boat. The island training is then shown in full, with Azumi ensuring the boys' safety by having a disguised mason watch over them during their stay. With the added bonus of toughening them up, of course. This ruse is only revealed at the end of the boys' time on the island, when the masked man jumps out and finally reveals himself. The main training under Azumi is shown shortly after, though the manga deviates from a strictly chronological telling here by showing Ed and Al returning to Resenbul first. We then get quite a few landscape shots to illustrate the passage of time before finally getting to the transmutation scene. This is shown in full and from Ed's perspective, meaning that we get his entire scene with the truth and his creation of the blood seal between Al and the armor. We were shown a scene of Al holding Ed at the Rockbell's door in an earlier conversation between Pinocchio and Armstrong, so the manga cuts straight from here to Mustang on his way to meet the brothers. We get a quick gag before Mustang discovers the transmutation circle, meets with Edward, and offers him the chance to become a dog of the military, an offer Ed takes up as soon as he heals from automail surgery. The exam itself includes a fun gag with King Bradley, but otherwise goes by very quickly. Once Ed is certified as a state alchemist, we see the brothers burn down their home in a show of resolve, before cutting back to the present. 2003 starts this section off with Al jogging Winry's memories about the first time she and Izumi would have met. Seeing as Winry joins the brothers throughout 2003's Dublith arc, it makes a lot of sense to use her as a stand-in for the audience at this moment. And it's at the beginning of this flashback that 2003 makes an ingenious call to combine the scene with Ed, Al, and Winry with the day of the Resin Bowl flood. This allows for a more tonally appropriate setting, as we mentioned earlier, and keeps the material from feeling too segmented. The flood itself is shown in slightly more detail, with Ed and Al explicitly attempting to help dam the river using alchemy. Their inability to do so further indicates that, despite being prodigies, they have a long way to go. Izumi's appearance, vomiting blood gag, and agreement to take on the boys as apprentices all goes just as it does in the manga. We then get a brief scene with the brothers and Izumi on the train. This is similar to the scene in the manga, but with Izumi expressing her disdain for state alchemists to the brothers, instead of Sig mildly protesting her decision. 2003 stops the flashback here though, and gives us an actual revisit to Dublith next. This bridges into an isolated flashback from their later training with Izumi. As for the island flashback itself, 2003 gave it a new purpose altogether. Due to 2003 exclusive plot points and characterization, Izumi has the brothers visit the island again upon their revisit to Dublith. We're then shown their current visit in tandem with their original visit through buttery smooth transitions. These present-day scenes serve to build a 2003 only plot point, while the sequences of the past stick pretty close to the manga up to Ed first fighting back against the masked man, who essentially vanishes upon this show of resolve, rather than sticking around to indirectly train them in combat. I don't really see why this was cut besides runtime limitations, as doing so makes the masked man appear less likable in hindsight. We also don't get a masked man reveal in the past, with present-day Ed and Al discovering his true identity in real time instead. This is a pretty strange call that I can only assume was done for time as well. 2003 handles the material after this chronologically, back in episode 3, albeit with the reunion of the brothers and the other Resin Bowl kids left out. This works well from a pacing standpoint, and is arguably more realistic given how determined they were shown to be well before even starting training. Why wouldn't they make a beeline for the old study the moment they felt ready to attempt human transmutation? And as we already covered, 2003 chooses to hold off from showing us the gate until much later. Barring that though, 2003 makes its way through the remaining flashback material from the manga, plus several manga plotlines retrofitted to be flashbacks, without a hitch from here. From a manga perspective, this all comes off as incredibly sporadic. However, 2003 wasn't trying to adapt the manga here in any strict sense. This is a story where Trisha continues to be very important to the boys' journey, not simply its impetus. This is a story where Rose remains important for a relatively wide swath of the runtime, not simply revisited once and then dropped again. Putting more emphasis on both of them early on like this was a good choice. And even if I'm not in love with the split it made in the backstory, its handling of the Dublith flashbacks once we get to them is fantastic. This shuffling around was very purposeful, and served to strengthen the greater story it intended to tell, something that can't be said for the show that came after. Brotherhood's adaptation of this material is a mixed bag, to put it mildly. The brothers' present-day visit to Dublith is heavily cut down to reach the flashbacks more quickly. The Resin Bowl flood and Izumi's ensuing appearance are both pretty strong, but it makes a strange deviation by having the townspeople take no initiative upon seeing this woman puke up blood. This means we get no hospital scene, with the equivalent material brought over to this setting instead. This is a weird call, as it saves almost zero time to do it this way. It comes off as an example of Brotherhood differentiating itself from the previous adaptation for the sake of it, even if doing so came at the cost of manga accuracy and made the townspeople look worse. Brotherhood wastes no time cutting straight from here to the island, with the train ride and all associated moments left on the cutting room floor. Even the island itself wasn't safe from cuts, as the masked man is nowhere to be found. I guess Izumi couldn't be bothered to make sure the boys didn't die out there over the course of a month. I'd also like to note how the shot composition differs quite a lot from the manga's presentation, while 2003 appears to match the paneling extremely well. Very odd, and one of the few moments I can think of where this is the case. Though it is another knock against the manga was a Bible narrative Eerie posted in interviews. Anywho, the island training transitions directly into the proper training at the butcher shop. This sequence makes a fantastic directorial call? Hallelujah! Azumi's dialogue is changed here to be avoidant on the topic of human transmutation, a change that I find is both very believable and able to further establish the core point of this material, that Azumi's teachings failed the brothers where it mattered most. This transition from her mentioning the truth is also really well done, as the gate acts as a great shorthand now that the audience is already familiar with the rest of the backstory. Unfortunately, this is where we go back to episode 2 in terms of chronology, and we don't come back to a very promising site. I get that I complained about Brotherhood's overly bright lighting earlier, but this sea of red and shading over the characters' eyes just comes off as cartoonish, and ruins the mood in the opposite fashion. Literally any amount of middle ground between these two extremes would have done so much to improve this, as can be seen in the side-by-sides of this in 2003. Thankfully, the episode finally starts getting its act together once the transmutation itself commences. While the bombastic horns of the 2003 score are a feast for the senses, I disagree with Goat Jesus' take that Brotherhood's score here can't compare. Cell-Shaded Music Theory did an excellent video covering this very scene, and I agree with his argument that these vaguely ominous strings are valuable in allowing the scene to vamp up, something the 2003 scene doesn't have to do thanks to its abrupt stop. For Brotherhood, though, this admittedly very slick transition from Alphonse's hand breaking apart to Ed in the Void of Truth is terrific. And at last, we reach the undeniable W for episode 2, that is, the truce scene. There's already been excellent coverage of this scene, so I'll keep it brief and say that this is the best Brotherhood's direction has been up to this point, and is perhaps the best moment out of the entire first 16 episodes. The rest of the episode is pretty strong too, as, unlike the setup with Ed and Al on the train to Lior, this new conversation between Roy and Maze works great in the new context. It's a shame it can't work within a manga one, in all honesty, but that doesn't mean FMABR can't find a use for it somewhere else. The remaining scenes with Mustang finding the brothers and Ed's ensuing alchemy exam are all really solid as well. It's just a shame about that first quarter, and the fact that they're stuck in an ill-fitting location. And hey, those are just the types of problems FMABR excels at fixing. So to refresh everyone on where FMABR finds itself, the only scene with Trisha we've gotten so far is the nightmare sequence near the start of episode 5. This is in keeping with the manga, a trend we'll see throughout this section. The only exception is the OP, which gives us very limited snapshots of the past. The start of official episode 11 was already pretty strong. The choir arrangement of Trisha's lullaby slowly swells as our vision focuses on him. It's also not far off from what the manga did, with Ed's monologue reminiscing about that man. However, the official cut does something a bit strange later on and gives us an extended version of this scene. This is followed up with some quick flashbacks of the boys growing up with Trisha, seemingly trying to make up for the lack of it in official episode 2. Since this montage was better suited to a later section of the episode where we get the full backstory anyway, I figured it was best to move the extended version of this scene back to the beginning and cut its later use. This decision leads to the episode opening with a fade-in and focus, rather than a cold opening with the title card. This not only enhances the dreamlike effect of the whole sequence, but also allows us to add the title card to the end of the sequence instead. This eerily mirrors the opening of Separate Destinations as the OP comes in. It's from here that we get Ed and Al visiting their teacher, but Brotherhood doesn't exactly take the same path with this material as the manga. These scenes with the four at the table, Mason is supposed to be here, with his response to Ed and Al talking about Rush Valley being the impetus for more scenes that Broho also cut. There's no sequence with the Dublith kids, nothing with the cat, it's all missing. Why? I don't know. Well, I do know. Production hell and runtime limitations, but that's not much of an excuse. It's also deliciously ironic given that 2003 stuck way closer to the manga regarding this material. Mason is here, the scenes with the Dublith kids are here, and Meni and Chico are made even more important and act as a great new setup for Ed to display his clap alchemy to Izumi. It's all great stuff, but you may have noticed certain someone is along for the ride in this version. As we touched on earlier, 2003's had Winry go to Dublith with the brothers in that version. While this is fine for this story, and even gives us a couple of great moments that couldn't exist otherwise, it sure does cause problems for a project like this. In earlier plans that unfortunately fell through, I did intend to have this stretch follow the 2003 take on events, with Winry simply cropped out of every shot. Early renders were promising, but behind-the-scenes issues meant that I had to revert to Brotherhood's handling of it. I may release the work-in-progress version at some point in the future in an attempt to garner interest in finishing it, but for now, some of Brotherhood's calls will have to be kept. This includes using Brotherhood's take on the table scenes, though we now cut immediately from them to the brothers and Izumi in the garden. This cut is somewhat abrupt, but thankfully, doesn't come with any contradiction short of the time of day. Izumi's sparring match also continues as it did in Brotherhood, but with a notable shift to the afternoon so I can work in a transition to the backstory. Again, an ideal cut would have used 2003 the entire time, so this break in continuity is only due to placeholders. Once we get to this point, however, I do my best to take the manga's collage and translate it into animation. The result is a fairly direct approach, as I chose to use standard white fade-ins and outs alongside the clapping transmutation Foley. There's also the call made to use part of Trisha's last words to her sons that, while technically not in the manga, serves this passage very well. As we fade from the collage to the flashback proper, we start with the 2003 original scene of the brothers first using alchemy to make a doll for Winry. This is an ingenious bit of foreshadowing for their later attempts at human transmutation, the core of this arc in both canons. We also run into a very small continuity error that most people will probably miss. Mr. Rockwell isn't too far off from the design we see later on, but Mrs. Rockwell is. She looks more like Trisha than she does the later Ishval flashbacks. I hope to change it at some point, as it is just a matter of changing one still, but it is a blink and you'll miss it kind of error. We stay with 2003 until the scene of the brothers and Trisha walking through the rural roads of Resenbul. This scene, combined with the follow-up of Trisha showing Ed and Al their father's study, is deeply similar to the manga's introduction to Trisha, just a bit more dynamic in its character moments and scenery. Al's narration about Dad leaving and the formative years the brothers had learning alchemy under Trisha's care is also kept intact from 2003, albeit with some Brotherhood footage spliced in where appropriate. Now we reach a couple of scenes that are sort of in the manga, but are considerably expanded upon in the 2003 anime. We start with this aforementioned example of Ed and Al going to present the... gifts. Let's call them gifts, that offer a new bit of dialogue thanks to Al's presence. We did already get a take on this scene in episode 4, but I think showing it in full here still adds to the episode. You could even say this version fills in why this moment made its way into Ed's nightmare in episode 4. Ed and Al also get a great interaction afterward, with Ed further reminiscing about his last memory of his father. One could argue this is redundant given how this episode starts, but I think showing how long this moment has been gnawing at Ed is important to his characterization. The second scene is this moment with Winry and Pinako after getting the news about the fate of Winry's parents. This scene is only shown in a single panel in the manga, but 2003 once again expands on it brilliantly. The added context of Winry losing her parents before Ed and Al, Ed responding to Winry's outburst by bringing up the concept of the homunculus for the first time in the series, this iconic shot of Ed running to Trisha afterward, this whole sequence goes down as one of 2003's best, and it's thankfully fully compatible with the manga. 2003's time skip to Trisha and failing health is also kept fully intact, as it's another example of 2003 adding its own accoutrements that work in both contexts. It's probably not surprising to see 2003 dominate the episode up to this point, given how bare bones and poorly directed Broho's attempt at this material was. That said, it's after the funeral scene that Brotherhood does get to make its grand re-entrance. Only for 2003 to take the wheel again one scene later. Fortunately for Brotherhood though, this anime-only scene gets to be more important thanks to the surrounding content. Including this scene also gave me a buffer between the funeral scene and the first scene depicting the day of the flood. I also took the opportunity to replace the score here, originally an arrangement of Brothers, with an arrangement of Trisha's lullaby. Remember, Brothers is a theme for Hughes specifically in the context of FMABR, so having it here was a no-go. As discussed before, 2003's choice to merge this conversation with the flood, and by extension Izumi's first appearance, was a sharp decision worth carrying over. Once we actually get to the river barricades though, all establishing shots and scenes with Izumi use Brotherhood footage, albeit with the music and pacing of the 2003 version to keep the scene of Ed and Al attempting a barricade of their own. A remnant of this can be seen in the first shot of Izumi, as this panel was originally a POV from the brothers standing alongside other townspeople on a hillside. While Brotherhood has some excellent animation here with Izumi's first appearance, I handed 2003 the reins for its hospital scene. 2003 continued from here to the scene of the brothers boarding the train and their conversation with Izumi aboard it. As for the island itself though, things get a little more complicated. While it may seem obvious to go with 2003's take on this, the lack of a reveal for the masked man makes using 2003 impossible. And besides, its more mean-spirited take on the masked man doesn't gel super well with Broho anyway. So, if we're keeping Broho's take on the island training, what do we do about Broho Izumi's negligence? Easy. We make it so Izumi and Sig visited the island at some point. Now I know what you're thinking. That's impossible. There's no footage of Izumi and Sig watching the brothers during their stay. And frankly, I would have agreed with you before I learned about these, the Fullmetal Alchemist 4 Coma shorts. This mini-series of cartoonishly drawn comedy shorts is pretty obscure. I'd never even heard of them until about a year ago. They're a bit hit or miss in terms of how funny they are, but one in particular stuck out to me, the short Nothing More Precious Than Something Free. Sure enough, this non-canon comedy bit has Izumi and Sig checking in on the brothers during their time on Yak Island. Not only that, but it didn't cause any other continuity errors that would make it unable to become canon, something that can't be said for all of these shorts. By simply tacking it onto the end of the episode as a canon inclusion, I have considerably, albeit not completely, exonerated Izumi from the gross negligence allegations. I'll take what I can get, I suppose. And with that, episode 11 of FMABR draws to a close with a direct lead-in to episode 12, First Day. This episode now takes on a double meaning, as it begins with the Elric's first day of training with Izumi, and ends with Ed's first day as a state alchemist. We open with Izumi, who is training the brothers in combat while reading a lesson from an alchemy textbook. As previously covered, this scene in Brotherhood makes a great deviation from the source material by having Izumi be more distant, hence the choice to use it here over its 2003 counterpart. As for the transition to the gate, footage of Ed and Al prepping for the resurrection now takes its place. I believe the end result better establishes what Izumi's teaching failed to impart, arguably better than even the manga. As for the prep itself, 2003 was the obvious choice for footage. Doubly so given its use in episode 1. Deviations only start as the light changes from gold to violet. While I keep 2003's initial transition, I cut to Brotherhood alongside a line from Al. This entire rebound sequence and Ed's visit to the gate are all from Brotherhood as originally shown, with the switch back to 2003 being held off until after Ed's soul transmutation and the ensuing episode bumpers. Al waking up and talking to Ed about what happened is arguably a bit redundant given everything we just saw, but the line,
"It wasn't the math, it was us,"
compelled me to keep it. The transition to Al at the Rockbell's doorstep is also kept, though we transition early to more Brotherhood material afterward. While a case can be made that cutting earlier and moving this moment to episode 6 would work better and keep more in line with the manga, I'd argue it gives away a little too much, too early. When Brotherhood returns, it's from the perspective of Roy and Riza coming across the remnants of the Elric's experiment. This choice does ultimately lose out on a clever shift in perspective that Brotherhood pulls, but Hughes being in these scenes makes them unusable for this sort of context. And besides, it wouldn't have felt appropriate to cut back to the military during this flashback arc anyway, since this is all framed as the brothers revisiting the past with Izumi. Anyhow, the remainder of this episode up to the ED is straight Brotherhood episode 2. The only exceptions are these two cutoffs to keep out the old framing device. This means Roy suggesting Ed for state certification, Ed's recovery, Al noting a lack of connection to the gate, and Ed's certification are all shown in full and in their Broho interpretations. While one could argue that 2003 did a few of these scenes better, I would say that Broho's take on each is still worth keeping over the alternative of redundancy, especially since the Elrics burning down their home happens later in the manga Broho canon than it does in the 2003 canon. It should also be noted that the flashback of the Elrics burning down their home was originally placed here in the manga, but Brotherhood moved it to Rush Valley. This makes for marked improvements in scenes within that episode, so I kept it where it was. This draws us to the ED of the episode, but not its conclusion. In fact, episode 12 has the longest post-credit sequence out of every official episode and recut alike. We begin with the implication that Ed stops his story there, with Izumi responding in kind with a bit of backstory of her own. This, and the scene of Ed and Al back on the island, are both from official episode 11. Since I elected to keep things mostly chronological though, it felt most appropriate to place it here instead. And with the new context, I believe they shine brighter than ever. With all that in mind, we enter episode 13, Beasts of Dublith. Now that the backstory has been told and we are firmly back in the present, it's time to cut back to a freshly transferred Roy Mustang. This is a Brotherhood-only scene that I appreciate a lot for its positioning of Mustang as an underdog in the military. This is a concept we get a much better feel for in 2003, and it's nice to see Brotherhood carry it over to some extent. However, the scene also acts as a replacement for one of Broho's most egregious omissions, Ed's second military exam. To keep Ed out of the ensuing meeting with Greed for half its duration, the manga has Ed run off to South Headquarters with some half-assed research, only to find Major Armstrong and King Bradley himself at the facility. Bradley gives Ed a passing score on the spot, and Ed promptly rushes back to Dublith, only for Bradley to follow him there. This whole sequence might be the manga at its funniest, and it's criminal we never got an animated version. As tough as it is to swallow this scene of Roy as a replacement for the ones with Ed and Bradley, I can acknowledge the Brotherhood wanted to do something different for the Devil's Nest that would have conflicted with its inclusion. We'll get to that later though. For now, all you need to know is that the scene no longer transitions from a much later scene from episode 14, but instead leads into official episode 13's first scene. From here, the official cut moves unabated from Izumi's expulsion of the brothers, Sig's words of wisdom, Izumi's plan to get Ao's memories back, and lastly, Ao's capture by Greed and his underlings. These scenes are all handled quite well, with my only gripe being Izumi's mention of an associate who could help get Ao's memory back, never being addressed later. In the manga, this associate was shown to be her doctor, with a vaguely similar scene making its way into the 2003 anime. Anyhow, the episode bumpers mark the first deviation since the beginning. Instead of the underlings and Greed each getting a card, we instead have the underlings and Ao. This will be bookended by Greed and Ed later on. These extra bumpers were sourced from official episode 1, as the new placement for that episode no longer necessitates their inclusion. Greed's conversation with Ao is initially quite close to Brotherhood, with the only change being some subtle color editing done to make the scene match 2003's lighting a smidge better. However, I make the first move of a major deviation at Greed's demonstration. In a move directly adapted from 2003 but using Broho footage, Greed's theme from the 2003 OST plays as he comes back from the dead. The music then continues throughout the Brotherhood scene until this line from Greed.
In that case, I'll just ask the person who did.
Instead of being used to cut away to Ed, this line now acts as a misdirect to bring in Izumi. Now seems like the right time to compare what happens next between each version, as none of them handle the material the same way either. In the manga, we get Ao fighting Greed's henchmen alone before being captured, Izumi breaking into the Devil's Nest, Izumi voluntarily leaving to pick up Ed after a very brief skirmish with Greed, then finally Ed entering the Devil's Nest to fight Greed and rescue Ao. While this allows for some top-tier gags and a couple of decent character moments, I would argue that segmenting these portions together makes for an awkward pace and unnatural ping-ponging of people to and from the Devil's Nest. It also feels a little out of character for Izumi to give up the fight with Greed so quickly, something 2003 clearly agreed with given how it rewrites the scene. In 2003, Ed and Ao both try and fail to fight off Greed's lackeys, with Ao still being captured. Izumi is then given information on Greed's whereabouts and breaks in to save Ao. She overexerts in an attempt to take down Greed, but buys enough time for Ed to find the Devil's Nest. Finally, Brotherhood elects to have Ao get captured even more quickly than in the previous two, having his lackeys hunt down Ed and bring him in, with Ed fighting Greed well before Izumi shows up. These are all radically different, and each of them would cause problems for FMABR. My favorite parts of this section of the manga are stuck there, so the amount of influence it had on this episode was relatively minor. 2003, meanwhile, relies pretty heavily on Dante for setting all of these pieces into motion, a character I can't realistically include. As for Brotherhood's original content, I'm not a fan of it and find it less appealing than both prior adaptations. Given my thoughts on each previous attempt, that left this episode of FMABR as perhaps the most distant from any of the material it's built from. Izumi's battle with Greed is sustained in full from the 2003 anime, followed by Ed coming in for the save, with Ed and Izumi briefly fighting together also kept in. This sets the stage for Ed to take over the fight for its remainder, only being stopped after the soldiers break in. Through this setup, Ed's fight with Greed is presented with greater importance and justification than all but 2003 managed before it. The scenes of Izumi collapsing again and Ed stealing his resolve for the duel against Greed go down as some of my favorite additions in FMABR. The use of Ed's theme works so well in this new context, and blends the sequence together in a way that truly soars above what the official cut managed in either case. That said, I'm not unaware of the problems caused by this particular collage of material. First off, Brotherhood follows the manga by having Ao and the henchmen run off before the fight between Ed and Greed gets going. This not only leaves the room empty for the entire fight, but also explains away any go-for-broke maneuvers Ao or Izumi may have tried once Greed uses his full shield. As is, FMABR doesn't address what Ao or Izumi are doing or thinking during this due to a lack of footage. Second, 2003 and Brotherhood have substantially different looking rooms that clash when combined like this. I did some minor color correction to the Broho footage, but actual color editing would need to be done to get truly desirable results. Both of these could be addressed in a later release, admittedly, but this episode does have a lack of polish in its current incarnation that can't be said for those surrounding it. With these limitations in mind, though, I think this episode has a superior grasp on Brotherhood's themes than the official cut, and consider the benefits to well outweigh the drawbacks. Last, and in this case least in terms of alterations, episode 14 follows up right where 13 left off. The Devil's Nest raid is made unnecessarily confusing in official Brotherhood, and there wasn't much I could do about it. In the official cut, the lackeys all go to the bottom floor after Greed gives the order before the fight with Ed. They then drop Al off and head to the higher floors to battle the soldiers. These motions aren't made clear at all, though, which makes for a very confusing watch experience. The only one of these that I was able to improve by any measure was the first, with Greed and his henchmen all shown heading to the bottom floor together. This still leaves the scene of the group dropping Al off and agreeing to split up and fight off the soldiers unaccounted for. But I'll take what I can get, I suppose. The episode now opens with a couple of brief skirmishes between soldiers and henchmen from the 2003 anime, before quickly jumping to the Brotherhood cut of Al struggling against Marta's control. This brief scene marks the very last use of 2003 video in all of FMABR, with one half exception we'll talk about in a later breakdown. Otherwise, this episode is straight Brotherhood. No, seriously, from a minute 40 to the episode's conclusion, it's just broho. And in all honesty, I'm amazed that episodes with so little changes haven't been more of a thing up to this point. Perhaps it's for the best things start settling down in terms of 2003 use though, especially given that this is the last episode of FMABR's main run. I have to admit, ending by covering episode 14 is a bit of an anticlimax, but I hope these episode breakdowns have effectively made my argument for why I felt the need to make the choices I did when making FMABR. Although, we're technically not done just yet. Tune in next time, where we'll cover the remaining altered episodes. Oh, and whatever happened to Mr. McDonald, I guess. See you there.